Short answer, this button, bang, 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 this button, wow! Long answer, good, hello, welcome to Onionskin. Are you good? Are you well? You shouldn't be, because you're a human and you're filled with filthy, filthy bones. Oh, look at me, I got bones and I can bend my arm 120 degrees. Is that all? What a joke. What you need in your life is some Deformers. Deformers are the joint and articulation system of tomorrow, and what any good 2D character thrives upon. Let's explore how they are and what they be. The deformation tool is the same as all of the other tools, like the brush, the pencil, the eraser, but it's in its own section because it was exiled. Fortunately, Deformers said, well, I don't need them, I'll get my own family, and it did, with all of these sub-buttons that complement how they work. We'll get to those in a moment. By default, they should exist in the top toolbar. Right-click if it's not there, and look for Deformation. Most importantly, however, is the Tool Properties panel, which, like every other tool in the program, shows us all of the modifiers that we can apply to it. In the Tool Properties, there are all of the different types of deformer. This first one, the one that is selected by default no less, is the automatic one. It chooses for you which type of deformation is most appropriate for the situation. Which sounds great at first, something being automatic, but then you remember that we're animators and we hate things being automatic. So if you're going to choose manually, is there one in particular that I recommend that you use all the time, 100% for every situation you encounter? Yes, the envelope. This is the envelope. It's the best. Now, I said that with a lot of conviction, so is there still a place for bones? Sure. Quick demo. There you go. Bing, bing, bing. And then they bend like that. They do tend to be getting used less and less these days, so they're just not going to be an emphasis today. I have, however, prioritized them quite a lot in the past with this series of rigging videos, which may still be worth a look if you're interested in that. So to do that, we need something to apply deformers to. Let's use this guy's neck. My nodes are currently set up like this. The body is across two different layers just so it can be behind and in front of the neck at the same time. Head and the body are separate, merged by a single peg and a color card to get things easier to look at. Now, the main deformer type used vastly majority of the time is this, the envelope, the Swiss Army knife of deformers. You can use it for all sorts of stuff. First of all, I'll show you its intended use, which is to trace around the edges of a shape like this. Notice it uses a vector Bezier handle type thing. As I get back to the start, hold Alt. Everything turns red for the sake of setup. I continue to bend, move all these around. If I hold Alt on one of the handles, I can break the smooth connection between them. And I sort of just want to line it up like this, so it just guides around the edge of the shape. So then by going to the transform tool, everything shifts to green. This means we are now in animation mode, and picking up and moving these points will mold the neck around like clay. This is an incredibly versatile method. You can get it to do all sorts of things. It can start to break if you get a little bit too crazy, but as long as you're sticking to fairly basic shapes without any real detail in the interior, then you can do essentially anything with them. Having a look at the node network, you'll see that a group has appeared. It's named itself. If we go inside, we get a chain of nodes with an offset at the beginning. That's this special parent piece here. And the chain works its way down in the order that they were created. It only connects back to the start because it's been told to do so in its layer properties. The act of pressing Alt turns on this switch, close contour. If I turn that off, it is now split and will move separately. Deleting that last curve brings it back to there. So you'll see that last node, it simply occupies the same physical position as the offset, and it is programmed to move along with it. That's how we managed to get an enclosed structure despite Toon Boom's very linear top to bottom structure. So that's not the only way to use them. I'll delete that and make a new one where I simply drag up and down like that. So this one's only made up of 2 points. And this will bend and move everything like that. So this is actually simulating one of the other deformer types called a curve. But many argue that it's better than a curve because you can move the root independently. This is the regular curve here. And if I show you with that one, you'll notice that the offset, the parent, is now become a controlling parent because just like a real controlling parent, it has this lever sticking out of the back. And that makes it a master. Moves the whole thing along. Most of the time you don't want that. You want both ends to be able to move on their own. And you may have gathered just by looking at the nodes that the envelope ones, they were called curve, weren't they? They are in fact the exact same thing, just with some different switches flipped. The main difference with the curve is that they have this apply parent transformation turned on as they work down the chain. And that's what gives it its nature like that. Now, the next thing about deformers is all about parenting, the basis of a rigging structure. Everything up until now, the head has not moved along with the neck. So I'm going to set up a curve style chain on the neck like this, with envelopes again this time. And if I connect from the neck straight down to the head, then the transformation will be applied. And it is perfect, completely beautiful, and no one will ever complain. If for some insane reason you don't want this happening, there is a solution. It's the kinematic output. Looks like this. And if that goes between the deformation and the head, now the head will follow along with that point, but its vectors will not be manipulated. So experiment with this. What do you think will happen if I take this middle curve here, which is this one, and that goes out to the kinematic output? What's going to happen now? The top one becomes independent, but the middle one will move the head. How about that? It even follows the rotation, although for some reason it doesn't refresh until you let go, whatever. This has gone a step further in Harmony 20, where if I say place the head like randomly here, if we take the point kinematic output instead, we'll have that linked into the end of the chain. This orange button at the top of the camera view is the show controls button. Whatever feature you're using, if it has some kind of controller, this button will tend to show it. We get this little blue icon in this case, and we can put this anywhere we want along this chain, and that's where the head will follow from. So we'll put it there relatively, along that line, and look at that. It is able to pin itself to a point along that line. Very, very nice. All right, standard deform is done. Here's where things get a bit more subjective and the complexity power creeps up exponentially. So buckle up, we are indeed going to be talking about how to turn a character. There's a few different ways it can happen depending on your needs and the style you're going for. I will demonstrate on these legs. I've got 3 angles, front facing, 3/4 and profile. And these legs each have 3 states. And I'm demonstrating on the legs because they physically move throughout the scene, right? Looking at this one, particularly moving into profile, it shifts inwards. Both of them do, so that moves quite a lot if you look at its pivot. What do we do when deformers are involved? On this front body, I drew this arm on the side, but on the profile, it's going to be like in the middle of the body, right? And these are just 2 raw drawings. If I move the pivot into the correct spot so it can turn, it's going to be in the incorrect spot for this one. And this problem is only amplified when deformers come into play. If I put a curve in here, sure, this one's going to work just fine, but it's the same bone structure for the second drawing. This is a huge problem. What do I do? What I would consider to be the meta of rigging is always changing, and the method a lot of people seem to be gravitating towards is the one I'll be showing here. There are some older methods which are still very applicable depending on what you're doing, and we may address that another time if you would like me to do so, but I want to try and keep this fairly concise. And that is simply to set up the pivots at the beginning. On frame 1, I'll create a blank drawing, which means we can turn the grid on and see where point 0 is. I'm going to draw a little dot in there, just so that when I go into transformation view, I can see where that pivot is, even when the layer isn't selected. And I can set that pivot up before doing any rotation. So, I want the pivot for the front-facing body to be here, and I want the profile to be here. So now everything's just automatically in the right spot, and I can go ahead and draw, and everything will automatically map to where it needs to be. But before you do that, the problem is we have animated directly on the drawing layers, and this is considered a bit of a no-no. We want to avoid that as much as possible and always have our positional data on pegs. So Control P, that arm gets a peg. I'm going to erase those original keyframes and prepare to do it again. Before we do it again, there is a really, really important step. There's a bunch of switches that we need to flip that change the relationship between the drawing and the peg, so that they talk to each other in a way that is a lot more deformer friendly. Select the peg and drawing in question and press this button up here in the node view, Set Properties on Many Layers. This can be done with a whole bunch of stuff at once, but these are the settings you want. 3D Path or Separate Mode, change to Separate. Use Embedded Pivot, change to Parent. Animate using animation tools, off. And Composite Mode, Pass Through. These are settings which are pretty much universally understood now. If you're curious about what these switches are, what is actually changing, how does it affect the program, stick around to the end and I'll go through all the really nerdy stuff. Yeah, so now, with that housekeeping out of the way, I can set up the pivots as I intended. So front facing will be there, profile will be there, and then we can just draw where everything is supposed to be and it will be fine. So that process is what I've done for my legs. Time to set up the deformers for them. First of all, it can be a bit hard to see what's going on. What's happening behind that arm? Handy trick, create a new display by pressing Ctrl Y. Hook that up, and then I can go up to this toolbar here, right click and activate display, and we get a new drop down menu. I can go down, you see this new one is called display 3. Select that, and now this leg is all we have. Wonderful feature. I make that deformer, it's all working well. And as we demonstrated before, because the pivots have been moved already, that means the physical drawing is going to move, bringing the deformation with it. So have a look at this chain. You can see it's nestled itself between the two, and the deformation is going to move with the leg on that point. And this is where we enter the discussion of the different types of turning something around. At the moment, there are two main ways that people like to do it: a 360 and a turnaround. Those are two different things. Two very different things. A 360 rig effectively uses the same drawing for everything. So I wouldn't have new drawings for these legs. I would have simply moved it over into position like that and done it all the way around. It seems like it's probably an easier method because there's less drawings involved, but it gets exponentially more complex very, very quickly. Like, just consider the face, right? How many layers would I need with envelope deformers going around them and stuff so that I could mold, like clay, this head and everything in it into this shape? Like, it's so much easier to just draw a new one, right? So it really depends on what you're going for. If you're willing to stomach it out and create that moldable piece so it can turn around, yeah, that makes your rig way, way, way more flexible, but it also makes the traditional elements of 2D animation way more limiting. Like going in and adding a different drawing, if it has like a really full-on expression, yeah, you don't really have that option anymore. You are stuck with the pieces that you have made in advance. Alternatively, you have what I'm demonstrating more on here, which is the turnaround method, where each angle has its own independent drawing. And if you need the rig to do something that it can't already do, then you kind of just draw a new one. So the rig can't do as much, but you get to draw more. So like you see what that trade-off is, right? I don't think one method is necessarily better than the other. It depends on what you're trying to do. So that molding into place method, there's not really much I really need to demonstrate with that here today. I've essentially just be building one and demonstrating it in time-lapse, molding all of those pieces. It's a relatively straightforward process. It's just really grindy, you know? Whereas this turnaround one, this is where things are a bit more technical and where a software tutorial is warranted. And that is with this back leg here. I'll go back to display 3. Notice that this deformer doesn't quite suffice, right? It's too short. And this is relatively common where you want a fresh deformer for each image. And fortunately, there is a built-in feature for exactly that. And it starts by clicking on the shape itself, then up in the deformation toolbar, there is this button here. Looks like it's got two nodes going into a green composite thing with a plus on it. This is create a secondary transformation chain. When you click it, everything disappears and you've essentially started from scratch. And you have. So build your new deformer chain, right? And you'll notice now, if we go inside this group, there is a lot more happening now. There are two deformation chains. Number 1 is the first one we did. Number 2 is the second one we did. And they go into this interesting composite thing called a transformation switch, and this just gets set up completely automatically. But effectively how it works is when you press that button, it puts this in automatically. It generates a drawing path. You see here it's connected itself to the right leg drawing. And for each one of these ports, Transformation 1 and Transformation 2, you can see them listed down here, and they have been assigned a drawing number based on their substitutions. So drawings 1 and 2, they both used the first one. They were similar enough, I don't really care to add a new one. And I just made a new one for the third. And that's what we see here. Transformation 1 and 2, and Transformation 2 has number 3. Okay, that's it. The rest of it is expanding upon those methods. Say, for example, I do have regular bones on this neck, and I wanted to have the option for envelopes as well. So the same thing can happen. I press that button, and it goes blank, and I draw in the envelope set. Both of them can exist at the same time, depending on the scenario that I want. By clicking on that neck, you'll see there's a drop down here now where you can choose between those transformation ports on the transformation switch. There you go. It's flipping between 1 and 2. On the transformation switch, that is reflected on the neck as well. An easier way to handle that, of course, is to simulate what we did with the extra leg. Have 2 different drawing substitutions of the same neck, exact same artwork, but the 2 of them are assigned to the different images, like this. So now in my drawing substitutions window, I can click here to choose between my different bone setups, which I think is a lot more visually intuitive than going to a drop-down menu. And you can press Control D on one of these. And if you're on Harmony 20 or above, you get this little padlock here that you can unlock. And then press Control D on one of these, and you can rename it to whatever you need. Now, it's a good idea to set up these names before you do the bones, because now, remember, these numbers here, what's it talking to? Number 1 doesn't exist anymore. It's called bones, so, there's nothing there. So I have to go in and type in bone. So this is where things get a bit fiddly, right? Especially with these modern methods. They're quite efficient, they're quite powerful, but you kind of need to know the order. Same thing with setting up the pivots that I talked about earlier, right? How I set that up with just like a little brush stroke. Because if you just sort of draw it first and then move the pivots, it's a real nightmare to fix. So to recap, the order is set up the drawing layer with a peg attached to it, go to set properties on many layers, switch them, separate mode, parent peg, off, pass through. Select the drawing layer, turn on the grid, draw a little dot on the 0 so you know where it is. Use the position tool here to move everything into the correct spot. Maybe it needs a rotation. I don't know. It's a bit weird because you're doing it blind, right? Then draw all the artwork in, plus any duplications for different bone types, whatever. Name those drawing substitutions correctly. And then finally make the bones themselves across all those different types. That should get you the most bulletproof results. Now, finally, to close off, we'll quickly run through what these settings are. The first one, 3D path and separate mode, is the 2 different options for tweens within Harmony. By clicking on one, here in layer properties, on transformation, there is position, and you see there's 2 checkboxes, 3D path and separate. By default, in the program, drawing layers are set to separates and pegs are set to 3D path. In a nutshell, a separate calculates the X, Y, and Z coordinates as 3 different animated tweens, whereas the 3D path sort of calculates it as one great big number. They both have their place. 3D paths can be more powerful, but they are also more troublesome. So most of the time, it is preferred to always be in separate. This can be amended by going to Edit, Preferences, and activate Default Separate Position for pegs. Then you just don't really need to worry about it, and in the rare occasion where you deliberately want to work with 3D paths, you can turn it on. It's a very deep topic, and if you want to learn more about that, I have a video called Everything You Need to Know About Parameters and Functions in Harmony. It's probably my single most overlooked video. It's over an hour long. I put a ton of work into it. It's essentially an entire course. And unfortunately, it sort of just slipped under the radar. So please go look at that one. I promise there's a lot of useful stuff in there. Use embedded pivot. This is all about the relationship between the drawing and the peg. They can both have their own independent pivots, after all, and things can get confusing. By having it set to parent peg, it's just given a degree of authority. Like right now on the head and neck, I haven't really done much deliberate with them. So you can see the neck one is bang in the middle. The head one is like a little bit above it. Let's like put it here. Okay. So it's like, it's super obvious. And then the peg is down here, which is sort of where I want it to be. And that's confusing, right? But if on all three, it's set to parent peg, then it just stops being a question. All three of them share the same one. Next is animate using animation tools off. Now, this one's probably a bit more self-explanatory from the first time I positioned that demo arm, right? With your standard transformation tool, clicking on layers selects the drawing and puts keyframes on them. And it gets messy. It's considered a no-no. So it has an option under the controls tab to be able to turn it off. And you'll notice then that all of the keyframe buttons and easing tools are just grayed out. It's completely inaccessible. Can't do it. No mistakes can be made. So the order from before is important because now that animate using animation tools is off, there is a keyframe here and I can't delete it. So I have to turn it back on in order to get rid of it. And then I'm good. Finally, composite mode set to pass through. This one's a little bit different because it's not to do with deformers, but it is very important in rigging in general. This is another one that can be set in preferences as a default in the general tab to default pass through composite. It changes all of your composites from looking like this to looking like this. And as simply as possible, it helps with Z-space. A bitmap flattens everything that goes into it into a single layer. So if you have one image that's way out in front and it's registered as a bitmap, by the time it gets to the camera, it's going to read everything as being way out in front. So pass-throughs, like 99% of the time, are just way easier to think about. Every individual layer in three-dimensional space is going to be sitting where you left it and not dictating where anything else goes. Phew, this was a biggie. All of those project files are going to be available on the Patreon. Going to be releasing them over the next few days. Everything from that simple like shock guy to neck man, this X-ray magnifying glass, which I made actually work for some reason. Lots of goodies to sift through. All of these available to the Patreon supporters. Thank you very much for that. It keeps these videos going. Now, all done. I hope that was useful. Any suggestions or questions, things you want to know more about, similar topics to this, please let me know in the comments. The more attention something gets, the more it is prioritized. Otherwise, I just end up making something silly that no one really cares about, like this.